Perfect. Let's go ahead and get kicked off here. So as Chloe was just talking about a second ago, kind of an add-on from last week, really focusing on the Transformers version here of a workshop that's fully focused on kind of the evolving world of data transformation. And as Chloe alluded to, there's several solutions out there that exist now, Coalesce being one of them. And we'll get into Coalesce and what it is here in a second. But I'll just give a really quick intro about myself. So as Chloe mentioned, my name is Josh. I am really a product marketing, but also a very technical data engineer over at Coalesce. So I get to kind of span the entire organization in terms of what I get to touch, but I get to do really fun things and kind of be an advocate for the brand and do cool things like working with the awesome team over here at Database Tycoon to do really cool presentations like this today. So we're going to be covering several things today. Basically, these four main points that have been brought up a couple times throughout LinkedIn, but I think really succinctly kind of measure what we're going to be walking through today, which is what defines a really strong data transformation layer in 2025? What are the trade-offs, really just generally speaking, when picking up any data transformation tool? What are the alternative approaches to modeling and orchestration? We're all pretty familiar with dbt, but what are kind of the alternative approaches there? And then we'll hear, I'm going to kind of anecdotally throughout the session today talk about stories from teams and companies and organizations that have picked up Coalesce and are utilizing it today in a production environment and getting benefit out of it. And so really today's session is all about people who have either hit a limit on or are curious about exploring their kind of expansion of their data transformation capabilities. You've either hit a limit or you're just kind of wondering what else is out there. We're going to be covering that entire gambit today, and also taking a look under the hood at what Coalesce is and how you can use Coalesce to help you build your data transformations, your data products, and produce data pipelines for any environment within your data platform. So what are we really solving for here? Traditionally speaking, data transformations have been done a lot of ways, and it's evolved a lot over time. I have here kind of on the left side of the screen, kind of the status quo, if you will, of kind of the traditional stored procedures, or maybe sticking views on top of your raw data and just trying to transform it in a way that might be useful, but is pretty difficult to scale and understand what's been built, much less share throughout the rest of the organization. Then we have really solid transformation frameworks available that kind of help us modularize a bit of that kind of traditional way of development, of data development, but it's still pretty code centric. And while that's not a problem, I think there's a kind of an additional layer here that we've seen throughout probably the past 5 years-ish or so in terms of traditional GUI tools coming in and providing us with a solution that gives us some of that code, but also gives us some kind of solutions that sit on top of a UI where can't really change things a whole lot, but we can tinker with them and then write code where it allows us to write code, which allows for less technical people to be able to contribute to products, but doesn't always necessarily allow us to have the flexibility that we need to be able to develop data pipelines and data transformations. That's where Coalesce really comes into play and where we kind of see us fitting into the broader picture of the data transformation bucket, which is giving users the flexibility to be able to write as much code as they want, but giving them that availability and that ability through utilizing speed that comes through working in a UI. And so when we get into kind of the demo portion of what Coalesce is today, it's really what we're going to be seeing is how do we modularize the way that we work and traditionally develop data transformations, do it within a UI, but have the flexibility of writing as much code as we want the entire time. And so we're really solving for this kind of last mile analytics supply chain bottleneck that has historically kind of plagued the entire data ecosystem, where we've been trying to solve this problem for a while. And there have been great tools that come around to help us solve that problem. But at Coalesce, we've seen kind of 6 major paradigms or problem statements kind of emerge over time. The first is that complex pipelines are really time consuming to build. The more complex they are, the longer they take to write. And especially historically, before we had AI agents really assisting us in that development, that was especially exacerbated in terms of how we were developing pipelines, just because it does take time to develop things that are useful and provide value for the organization. And on top of that, when there's complexity, it can be really difficult to kind of maintain and scale those pipelines, especially when it comes to things that are more complex and trying to understand how you're going to be able to manage things, for example. Maintaining and scaling those projects or those pipelines becomes really difficult to do. And on top of that, the standardization and governance when you're trying to grow those pipelines environments typically becomes pretty difficult to manage. And with that standardization and governance sometimes lacking in those environments, really kind of becomes the Wild West when it comes to the data transformation landscape within organizations. And that often leads itself into a lot of tech debt. We have all these things that have been developed over time that have been written by a lot of different engineers that are at different levels. And it just becomes a relatively large pile of tech debt that the organization then has to determine how they're going to prioritize. Are we going to try to work through some of that tech debt? Are we going to try to continue building on top of it and refactoring it as we go? How are we going to go about developing our data pipelines and try to provide value with our data organization with the tech debt that currently exists? And like I said, when you have that tech debt, deployment and change management becomes pretty difficult to do because you don't know if you're going to update a specific column within a model, if it's going to break 3 other models or break all the columns that lead all the way to a dashboard, for example. Which kind of leads into the last point here, which is really poor visibility and data into the data lineage and really the ability to perform any sort of impact analysis within your data pipelining solution, especially with more traditional ways of writing pipelines like stored procedures. You really have to be able to manage things really, really, really tightly to understand exactly what's going on. And a lot of times that exists in one or maybe a couple different engineers' heads. And if they end up leaving the organization, that becomes a problem for everyone because they don't have that tacit knowledge that existed in their head about what actually existed in the pipeline itself. And so that's kind of the problem and the bottleneck that we're trying to help solve for in an automated way here at Coalesce. And so we're really focused on solving the T in the ELT process, and specifically the ELT process. That's kind of the paradigm that we really try to follow here at Coalesce, which is we allow really great solutions that exist today, like Fivetran or Airbyte or Estuary, to go out and grab that data and load that into the target platform of your choice. If you're using Snowflake, Databricks, Fabric, doesn't really matter. Whatever data platform you're using, once that data has landed in that platform, that's where Coalesce really comes into play to help pick up that raw data and allow you to automate your data transformation and your data pipeline development workflows, turn that data into something that's really usable, whether it's different data pipelines to solve different problems or data products that you're trying to develop for the organization. That's what we're focused on trying to solve for here at Coalesce, but doing that in a way that is both really standardized and in a really automated fashion. And you'll see here at the bottom of the screen, we're not really going to touch on this today, but we have the governance that comes from that end to end from what we call Coalesce Catalog, where we can build out pipelines utilizing Coalesce. But once those products are built, those pipelines are built, we have the entire understanding of what exists, why it exists, how it exists, and where it exists, and most importantly, who owns that, which I think is a big piece that often gets missed out on when it comes to data pipeline development, especially modern data pipeline development, is the ownership component of who actually owns the data. That really comes into play when you have a stakeholder that comes to you and says, I don't understand why the number says this. And it really takes time to go back through and try to figure out why the number is saying what it is, how it originated to begin with, and why the logic was written that way to begin with as well. And so that's what we're trying to solve for here at Coalesce. And we'll go really, really quick over this slide. Basically, how do we do this? We do this through an automated solution by giving you access to that UI that we talked about, and we'll see this here in a moment, but also giving you the flexibility to write code, but also in a really standardized manner, which means that you have a shortened learning curve and you have faster development cycles that come with all of the standardization and governance from that ability to be able to standardize exactly how pipelines should actually be development. And we really like to talk about this idea of data architecture as a service at Coalesce, where we really want to provide you with this out-of-the-box architecture that gives you the flexibility to be able to extend it however you want, but that's built into the solution as soon as you start working with it. And so the ability or the inability to be able to have tech debt or misgoverned objects, for example, becomes much less likely because architecture is built out of the box or comes out of the box with Coalesce. And so little diagram here basically of what we've talked about so far, where we have the sources that are moving data into the platforms that we're working with. And Coalesce is really empowering the entire kind of gambit of both technical and non-technical users within an organization to be able to develop solutions, develop pipelines, develop transformations, give that to stakeholders who might be partially technical or non-technical at all, and allow them to use this catalog component to be able to understand exactly what's been built, why it's been built, where it's come from, and who owns it as well. It provides this really cyclical and really powerful pipeline of going back through this flywheel of going back through and be able to continue to iterate through exactly what's existing and what needs to exist within an organization. So why does this matter for people who are actually using Coalesce? Like we've already talked about a little bit, just addressing some of those problem statements that we started with. You have a lot of faster time to insight because we're using standardized, already architected solutions that mean that we don't necessarily have the sprawl that comes with traditional pipeline development. We've improved data quality and trust because we have the ability to be able to break things apart into standardized components that are easy to track and they're easy to understand exactly what's being built. You can scale things really easily without the added complexity because we're giving you the ability to leverage the same standard over and over again, instead of having to have a junior engineer write things one way and a senior engineer write things another way, and whoever's approving the code maybe wants it to be written a slightly different way. Everything is a standard within Coalesce, and that's how we develop within the platform. Developer productivity and efficiency. This one's really straightforward because of these standards, which we're going to talk about here in just a second and see within the demo. It is really easy to quickly build without leaving behind a lot of tech debt. And then the last two components here, reduce deployment risk and faster time to production, just again, because of some of that developer productivity and that scalability that comes with it. And then again, kind of governance by default. It's built with this in mind. It comes out of the box with this governance available to be able to manage everything that's being built. And so we're going to transition over here in just a second into an actual demo here. But before we do, I want to talk about this one concept that you've been hearing about, but I haven't named yet, that we're going to be seeing on the screen. And it's this concept of what we call a node, N-O-D-E. And it's basically, you can think of a node as a user-defined template of an object that exists in your data platform. So I'm going to be doing this demo on top of Snowflake today. And so you can think of every node that you're seeing as effectively a table or a view, but we can also templatize much more complex and advanced functionality, maybe a type 2 slowly changing dimension, or even Cortex functions that are available in Snowflake. We can templatize those, define them one time, and then give our users the ability to use those objects over and over again, so that regardless of who's using it, albeit a really, really new young junior developer, all the way through to a really experienced senior developer, they're all working from the same base. They still have the flexibility to use and write as much SQL as they want, but it's all governed through a user interface, which allows them to work really quickly. So that is the concept that we're going to be seeing here on the screen in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over into Coalesce and give a little bit of a walkthrough here of what Coalesce is and how we can develop pipelines really, really quickly within Coalesce. So what we're looking at here is what we call the projects page in Coalesce. And you'll see here on the left-hand side of the screen that I have a couple different projects that I've created. And some of them have more descriptive names than others. This one at the bottom called Summit Demos, probably you can guess, is if you're at any of the recent conferences, use that project to be able to basically do demos there. We're going to be inside this project here called Coalesce Hands-On Labs today. And you can think of a project as basically a container to be able to do work that's tied to a specific objective, team, or domain. And so if you have specific domains, or maybe you want to have more of a data mesh architecture within your organization, you could have a project per domain. Or maybe you have specific initiatives within your organization, you could have a project per initiative. And each project has a Git repository tied to it, one-to-one. And so if you have a project, you're going to tie that to a Git repository to allow you to version control all of the work you're doing along the way. Within each project, we have what we call workspaces, which is what you're looking at here. I have one workspace that I've created here. It also has a branch that's associated with it as well. And you can think of a workspace as effectively a sandbox for developing the products or the pipelines or the transformations that you're going to work with. And once you develop something within a sandbox, you can then deploy that to a higher environment within your data platform, whether that's, again, Databricks, Fabric, Snowflake. Go ahead and deploy that into a higher environment. So let's go ahead and start building so we can understand a little bit more about how this works. So I'm going to click on this launch button here, and I've already connected my workspace here to Snowflake. And so I don't have to go ahead and do that. I can just pull in data from my Snowflake account to start building out my data pipelines. So how do we do that? In the upper left-hand corner of the screen here, we have this little plus button. And I have a couple different actions that I can take when I click this plus button. And the one that I care about here is I want to add data sources. So I'm going to go ahead and click on add sources here. And it's going to pull through any of the databases and schemas that I've given Coalesce access to within my Snowflake account. That's a step that we're not going to cover today, but it's very straightforward to just be able to configure Coalesce to only have access to specific databases and schemas within your Snowflake or any other data platform account that you're connected to. And there's several different locations that I could work with here, but I have this database and schema here called cortexhol.rawpos. I've given it a name of sales that I want to work with the data coming from here. And these are just representing tables or objects that exist within my Snowflake schema in this case. And so I can either click the little hierarchy checkbox here to select all the objects, or I could pick and choose specific objects to add in. Maybe I don't want this new orders object, so I can deselect it. And once I've selected all the tables or all the objects I want to add in, I can just select add 5 sources. And that's going to bring these 5 sources in as this concept of what we call a node within Coalesce, which is why I defined it before we jumped in here, where we have these data source nodes that are available now within this build interface, as we call it. And this area is where we can start building out really quickly, leveraging a UI, but also giving us the ability to write as much SQL as we want to build out our pipelines. So let's explore one thing real quick before we start building out here. What I want to do is right-click on any of these nodes selected or these data sources that are available to us, right-click on one and see all of the options that are available to be able to start working with this data, with this source data coming through here. One of the big ones here is this add node section. This add node section is giving me out-of-the-box options that come with Coalesce to be able to start building out my data pipeline. And in this case, I have kind of some dimensional modeling style nodes available to me to start working with my data. And you'll see here, one of the nodes is a stage. And me as a data engineer, I really appreciate and enjoy when building out data pipelines, having some sort of working or staging layer that does some initial transformations and helps kind of set up more of a silver layer style of my data pipeline that prepares my data to be done by more advanced analytics or more advanced work streams further downstream of where I'm working right now. So we're going to be working with these stage nodes, but I want to call out one more time this idea of a node where we have defined how the functionality of these nodes have worked already. They're defined one time, and then we can use them over and over again. And so we're going to see how that works here right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my nodes that are currently my data source nodes that are currently existing here within my build interface. I'm going to right click on any of them. I'm going to go back to that add node section where we just were. And I'm going to click on stage. And you're going to see that we immediately added a staging table or a stage table to every single one of our data sources. Now, we haven't really done any sort of data transformation on that data coming from our data sources yet, but we have put in the object to be able to start working with that data for every single one of those data sources. Because again, this is just a template where we've defined it one time. We've defined the logic of how this object, this stage table, should work one time and can reuse it over and over again. So how do we actually transform data utilizing Coalesce and these nodes? I'm going to double click into this stage customers node. We're going to see a couple different things here. First, we're going to see the actual schema that's coming through from our data source. We'll see customer ID, first name, last name, and a lot of other columns coming through from our data source. You're also going to see things like the data type associated with that column, the source of where it's coming from, in this case, that customer data source, and a lot of other metadata here as well. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have what we call our configuration options. And these are options that we make available to our users when we define how this node should be displayed to you as a user. So for example, I can just through the user interface, change the materialization of this object from a table to a view if I want, just by clicking the button, because we've defined that if a user wants to use a table or a view, Coalesce knows exactly how to automate that underneath the hood, because that's already been defined. And there are a couple other options available here as well, different toggles that we can select on and off to be able to provide additional functionality. You can even write in pre and post SQL to be able to execute before or after this table runs itself. And then at the very bottom of the screen, we have what we call the create and the run buttons, which are basically allowing you to execute your DDL and your DML. So if you're not familiar with that, your DDL is your data definition language. That's going to allow you to create the object inside your Snowflake account. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look at that. If I click on this create button here, we're going to see that we executed that successfully. And Coalesce always exposes all of the SQL that it's creating every single time to you as a user. And so in this case, we can see that it's running a create or replace table statement inside this PC Coalesce DB database, inside my public schema, and it's creating an object called stage customers with all those columns and data types that we have here in that mapping grid that we were just looking at. And if you see here, we have the stage customers table being created. That is because we could easily rename this table up here to something different, but it's taking this into account, this specific name right now into account, to be able to pass that through when it's executing. And then when we click the run button, this is executing the DML, or the data manipulation language, that's allowing us to effectively populate the object that we just created. So when we click the create button, you can think of it as building a house. And then when we click the run button, we're actually moving all of our furniture into the house, or AKA the data. We're actually inserting data into the object or the table itself. And again, we can view the execution steps and see the exact insert into statement that Coalesce ran. Now, we haven't transformed anything at this point. And so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about how we can standardize and modularize standardization and writing SQL within Coalesce. So as you can see, everything so far is basically a template. It's a standard. And this is what it looks like every single time that you use a stage node. But the SQL, or the actual business logic that you want to apply, is typically always different. So how do we apply that? Let's use some really simple examples here. We have this transform column that exists here that's blank right now. And this transform column is available for every single one of our columns available in our table schema. And if I double click into the transform column next to any of our columns here available in our schema, it's going to open up a SQL editor. And this is going to be the area where I can write any column level SQL statement that I want to transform any of my columns. So it's always a standardized way of being able to write SQL for each column that I want to work with. And so in this case, let's do something really simple. Let's use like the upper function, and a really quick caveat here. If something works in Snowflake or whatever data platform that you're using, and you're also using Coalesce, it's going to work in Coalesce as well. So if you could write it in Snowflake, you can write it in Coalesce as well. And so this is just straight Snowflake SQL that I'm writing here. So I have this upper function, and I'm going to pass through this handy dandy little thing called the source token, which is just a tiny little snippet of Jinja that allows me to resolve my column name dynamically to the name of the column that I want to transform. In this case, the first name column. And so if I hit the return key here, it's going to go ahead and apply that upper function. And now I have that really, really simple business logic available here associated with this first name column. Now, I could do anything within, again, this specific node here where I can write any SQL that I really want to support from a business logic perspective. And that could be substrings, that could be aggregates, it could be date-based functions. It does not matter. If it's supported within Snowflake or whatever data platform you're using, it's going to be supported here in Coalesce. And we could continue to write SQL here, but I want to show one other portion of this node before we move on and do a couple more things at a little bit faster pace now that we have a bit more of a conceptual and visible understanding of what a node actually does within Coalesce. Last thing we're going to do is we're going to jump over to this join tab here. And you're going to see there's already a line of code that's been written here in the join tab. And this is where Coalesce is establishing the dependency to any of the upstream objects that it's connected to. In this case, it's that customer's data source. And so it's basically saying, hey, we're going to select all of the columns from this mapping grid, and we're going to select them from this specific dependency, in this case, the customer's dependency, and we can continue to apply any logic here. So for example, we could write a where clause or a filter here, and we could say where maybe customer ID is not null. This could be something much more complex. We could write a window function here if we wanted to. We could write any custom logic here that we want to. But once we've applied that information or applied that logic, then we can go back through and actually rerun this specific node and see what is actually taking place underneath the hood. So let's go ahead and click on this run button again. I'm going to bring the results up here just so we can see them a little bit more clearly. We're going to let this run. And what it's going to do is it's going to take into account all of the logic or the business logic that we applied without us having to write any of the DDL or the DML ourselves. Just allows us to focus on how do I want to transform my data, building out my pipelines really quickly. And so we can see actually that the first name column here has been transformed, and it is all uppercase in this situation. And so far, it doesn't look like we have any customer IDs that are null either, which is good for us. I'm going to click on this execution step to take a look at what happened here. We can view the insert statement here. And we can see a couple things that are different from the last time we looked at this. The first is that we have an upper function that's been applied for us, and Coalesce passed that through into Snowflake to run on our behalf without us having to write any of these other lines of code to run on our behalf. And then we also have that filter at the bottom here. And yes, I wrote lowercase SQL. I apologize for those of you who really prefer uppercase. I love lowercase. So I'm the standout at Coalesce when it comes to writing SQL. So I have to apologize there a lot. But we have all of that applied here, where the business logic that we said we wanted to apply to our data now exists. So we've seen basically at a high level how a node works, or how these staging nodes work. Let's explore a little bit further how we can build really, really quickly within Coalesce, and again, make these pipelines or make these data products available to the users that need answers. So let's say we want to join some objects together, some tables together. I'm going to grab this stage order header and then this stage order detail table, and I can select the two independently. I'm going to right click on either one. I'm going to navigate to join nodes, and maybe this time around, I want to create a view. So I'm going to select view here, and it's going to bring through all of the columns from both tables. Now, I actually need to join together both of those tables. So how do I do that? I'm going to navigate back to this join tab, and you're going to see that Coalesce basically tried to infer the entire join of what we were working with here. In this case, all I need to do is be able to replace the column placeholder for the join condition that I'm working with. And so in this case, I know that order ID is the column that I want to work with. So I'm just going to say order ID and then replace this column placeholder with order ID as well. Now you'll probably notice that order ID is in both tables, which means that we're going to have duplicate column names. So we need to remove at least one of them, if not both of them, before we can run this, because we can't have duplicate column names in an object that exists in a database. And I actually just know from firsthand experience that there's one more duplicate column name in here called discount ID. And so I can independently click on either of the columns that I'm working with, can right click on either one, and then delete the columns. So I'll just select delete here. And now I can go ahead and create this as a view. And I really quickly join together two different objects. I can perform any transformation in the upstream objects, but also any transformation here, which I really didn't do in this case. I just joined the two together, but started to really quickly build this out without having to run any DDL or any of the DML myself. Let's talk about a little bit more advanced use cases when it comes to more of the style of modeling and transformation that more people are probably accustomed to. We've done some really basic and kind of cute things so far, but not a lot of value so far. Let's do a little bit more advanced style of data transformation, providing functionality that a lot of organizations are looking for. So in this case, let's move back to the stage customers node. We applied some really basic transformations here. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to go back to add node. And this time around, I'm going to add a dimension node. We've been working with views and stages so far, basically just tables and views. And a dimension node is going to be created as a table or persisted as a table within Snowflake as well. But there's some additional functionality here that saves users a ton of time and allows them to have this standardization of whatever they want to leverage from either type 1 or type 2 slowly changing dimensions within this node without having to write any of that type 2 slowly changing dimension code themselves. So if I click on the configuration options over here on the right-hand side of the screen, I can pass through a required field here called business key. So I'm going to click on customer ID as my business key and just pass that through as my business key. And then from a change tracking column, if I want to set this up as a type 2 slowly changing dimension, I can just select the columns that I want to track changes on, maybe first name and last name in this case. Maybe there's more in here. Maybe I want to track on email as well. And I can pass that through as the 3 columns that I want to track changes on. And so now I have a new table here called dim customers that has all of my columns coming from my stage table or my stage node. And it also created a couple new system columns for me where I'm able to track basically which columns are current, which have been deprecated, and the timestamps associated with them. So when I go to create this, it's going to create the object in Snowflake. It's going to create the table, builds the house for me. And then when I click the run button, this is where that magic of really having templated and user-defined functionality one time and be able to reuse it over and over again really comes into play. And so if I click on dim customers here, we can see that Coalesce ran a merge for us to actually insert data into this object. And if I open it, we're basically going to see best practice type 2 slowly changing dimension code within this little code editor here. It's going to run, it will run a merge into our table, dim customers, and it's going to leverage all that type 2 slowly changing dimension code that historically you're either going to have to know how to configure or write some of yourself. And this is handled for you on your behalf, and it runs really quickly because it's very modular, and any of the logic that you apply to it is going to be isolated to that one specific object. So runs really quickly, which depending on the platform you're running on means save costs, but it also means you can develop really quickly. If I'm taking some new data sources and I have someone who's come to me and said they need specific data product or pipeline to power something they're looking for, I can develop this out really, really quickly. One more thing that I want to show before we kind of wrap up the demo here is this idea of being able to extend all of the functionality of our pipelines. So far, we haven't really done anything crazy exciting, but we've used some cool templates to be able to allow us to transform data, apply type 2 slowly changing dimensions. We put a view in here, but that's not all the most up-to-date functionality that I necessarily care about when it comes to developing pipelines on Snowflake. And I might want to be able to have some of that functionality myself that I custom integrate into Coalesce. So there's two things that I want to show here. We're going to navigate down here to the build settings in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And we're going to navigate to this node types area. And this node types area is going to be where all of the nodes that we're working with are currently available to be used within this workspace. And you'll see they're all currently toggled to on, or they're enabled to be used within this workspace. And you're probably wondering how this all works underneath the hood. And so we can go ahead and take a look at what this actually looks like. So the stage nodes that we were using a second ago, every single node is made up of really 3 components. And in some cases, like a view, it's just 2 components because views don't actually populate anything. It's basically just a stored query underneath the hood. And so in this case, we don't actually have to apply what we call the run template. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's just walk through what each of these different templates means. So the first thing we do is we define what we call the node definition, which if you remember from looking at any of the stage nodes, that's going to be the options that are available on that right-hand side of the screen, such as whether or not we can select a table or a view. In fact, if we select any of the objects that are currently in our workspace, we can view those configuration settings over here. And if I were to remove one of these things, such as the materialization selector, it's no longer going to be made available. Oh, I didn't get rid of it. It's no longer going to be made available over here. It just keeps popping back. It's because I'm looking at this in a view. You'll see that these are read only. But you can see that it disappears for a second. If this was actually one that I was editing right now, this would disappear from the actual configuration settings. So this node definition is where we can actually define what we make available to our front end users when they're working with a node, which then means we can take anything that we're giving our users access to and apply it to the create and run template. And I'm not going to go through all the logic here, but basically what's happening is that we define exactly what should be automated within Snowflake using Coalesce. And so we're saying, hey, if the materialization type is a table, we're going to run a create or replace table statement, and we're going to loop through the columns that are available in that node. And if the materialization is a view, we're going to run a create or replace view statement, and again, loop through all of those columns, making sure that they're available when we execute the DDL for this object. And the same is going to be true for this run template. So when it comes to a stage, we're basically looking at the materialization type, and we're taking into account all of the features that are available on the right-hand side of the screen, such as the truncation and any of the tests that are available here as well. And once it does that, knows how to insert the data into the object that we're working with. And so this is how this idea of templates really comes into play, where instead of just giving our developers free range to be able to run around and be able to develop any nodes or models or tables that they want, we set the standard up front to define things one time and then give everyone access to be able to work from that same base, which provides a lot of visibility, a lot of transparency, a lot of standardization, and a lot of ownership built into your data transformation layer. One last thing I want to show, just from a functionality perspective, is if we go back to the build settings, we have this section in here called packages. And this is where you can really extend and start working really quickly with more advanced functionality. And packages is an area where you can install from what we call the Coalesce Marketplace, extended functionality to be able to build out your data pipeline much quicker. And so if I click on this browse button here, it's going to pop us over into this package marketplace section where you can see a lot of functionality available. We have things like Cortex package or testing, or let's see what else. We have data quality in here, deferred merge, If you're on Databricks, Delta Live tables in here, a lot of functionality available to be able to extend all the features that you typically want to work with without having to develop them yourself. And because I'm on Snowflake, I'm going to grab this Cortex package real quick. I'm going to copy the package ID here, which is called coalesce/snowflake/Cortex. And this is basically just all the documentation about how you can use any of these nodes that are contained in this package, which we can see here. And I'm going to pop back over into Coalesce. I'm going to click on install. I'm just going to paste the package ID into the package ID parameter here and just call this package ID Cortex. And this package alias is how I'm going to be able to identify where my nodes actually exist. And we'll see this in just a second. Once I click install, pretty much instantaneously, I'm going to have access to all that functionality from a Cortex perspective from Snowflake. So if I pop back over into my build interface and I work with a new table, maybe this stage reviews table, I can right click on it, go to add node. This time around, I'm going to go to Cortex and I'm going to use this Cortex functions node. And you can see all the functionality that's available here. We can do anomaly detection, forecasting, could leverage document AI from Snowflake. In this case, I'm going to use Cortex functions. So I'm going to click on this and it's going to pop us inside of a node where I can take advantage of some Cortex functionality here. I'm going to go ahead and click on fetch data so we can actually see the data coming from here. And we can see that we have some plain text reviews that are coming from this fictional order, this food truck that I've created, this fictional data. It's available here from these reviews. And something that I might be interested in doing is maybe creating a sentiment score to understand how my customers actually feel about my specific products. In this case, they ordered from me. I want to know how they feel about them. And I do have the star rating here, but I want to perform a sentiment score to be able to understand a little bit more about how they feel about my products. And so all I need to do here is be able to pass through the column that I want to apply that sentiment score through into this parameter here. And normally I would just go ahead and select the review text column here, but I'm actually going to duplicate the column and I can just right click on it to duplicate it. And the reason I want to do that is because in Snowflake, if you were to pass a column through to any of these Cortex functions, it's basically going to return back to you the overriding result of what you were looking for. So you're not going to actually have the original text anymore. You're just going to have the new result. I want to keep the original text. So I'm just going to duplicate the column and we'll just give this a new name of review sentiment. And now all I have to do is pass review sentiment through here as my selected column. And this is quite literally how easy it is to be able to take advantage of a standardized way of working with Cortex functionality within Snowflake, within your nodes, and giving especially non-technical users a really easy way of being able to provide value for the products or the projects that they're working on. And we can actually see here that we now have a review sentiment column that has everything ranging from -1 all the way to +1. And so just a really simple example of how we can continue to extend all of the functionality of how we build in Coalesce. And we could continue to easily build here if we want to, but I wanted to just give a little taste about how this idea of standardization really applies to kind of building data pipelines within kind of the modern context of how we build today, and how a lot of organizations are starting to leverage tools like Coalesce to be able to build a really solid foundation without having to sacrifice a lot of tech debt to build really quickly, but still have access to define and write as much of that SQL as they want. Real quickly here, we have this Git integration that's built in. I'd said right at the very beginning that each project is going to be version controlled by Git. And so we could commit anything here. In fact, we'll just give this a fake commit. We'll push this. This is just my own Git repo, so I'm not worried about anyone getting involved here. And if I go to this deploy tab, I can have any of my environments that I've set up, higher environments within my Snowflake account, databases and schemas where I want these objects to go. And I can just click on the deploy button, select the specific branch that I'm working on. There's that commit message that I just created. And if I want to deploy all the work that's been done in that commit, I can just come through here. I don't have any parameters that I needed to pass through, so I just skip that step. And it's going to scan everything that we're about to deploy. Everything looks good. And so I can deploy all of that work directly into my Snowflake account, and I can schedule that pipeline to update on any cadence that I want to make sure that my users have access to all the data they need on the schedule that's most useful for them. And so that is how we approach data pipeline, data transformation, data product development within Coalesce. Some real quick kind of customer success stories that I kind of want to highlight. And we've already talked about this a little bit, There's a few components that a lot of customers really get excited about and gain a lot of benefit from when utilizing Coalesce. First is that I typically see a lot of compute savings, and it's nothing that we're necessarily doing at Coalesce. We're not necessarily optimizing queries in an extra fancy way underneath the hood while they're running on Snowflake. We're not somehow injecting faster compute engines into Snowflake or whatever data platform you're running on. We're just using the compute that's already available within the data platform that you're running Coalesce on top of. But what we do is we allow you to develop in a way that is really modular, as you're seeing here, and allows for all of the components that typically need a query plan to be able to work through in a more complicated way to be broken up in really modular segments, which means that things typically run really quickly, and only things that need to run when they've been updated are actually running. And so if you normally have a really long CTE, for example, each step in that CTE needs to run whenever that specific model is executing, you don't have to do that in Coalesce. So we typically see a lot of customers saving compute, somewhere in the ballpark of 10 to 30%, depending on what they're doing, when utilizing Coalesce, just because of this modular approach. And we didn't really talk about how we think about breaking up logic within Coalesce, but you can almost kind of think about each of these nodes being a logical step within your pipeline. If I need to transform my customers so that we're removing certain customer IDs and we're replacing null values with a specific value and whatever else, that's a logical step that I'm performing, and that can then pass that information or that clean data onto the next step. And that's kind of how we think about this modular approach within Coalesce. Another really important component that a lot of our customers really appreciate is onboarding is really, really quick. And kind of as you've seen here, there's certain objects that come out of the box. There's certain nodes that come out of the box. But because everything is standardized, there isn't a proprietary syntax to learn. There's not any sort of core functionality that doesn't necessarily make any sense. If you can write SQL and you can learn kind of the inner workings of how this node works, which we kind of started with in this session today, that is kind of all you need to do to get up and running. And then you can immediately, just like we saw, plug in certain extensible packages into your data pipeline, and you can take advantage of really complex functionality really, really quickly. Another big win is that whether you're a junior engineer, a senior engineer, or even a non-technical person, you can actually contribute to projects, whatever your data team is working on, and sometimes can contribute in a really meaningful way because we're just working with these standards that have been defined once and we can reuse over and over again. And then this really enforces this idea of trust and ownership, because we can go back through and look through exactly what's been built, and we can trace things all the way down to the column level, which we didn't really get into, but we can right click on any of these columns and view all of our columns all the way down to the column level to understand exactly what has been done, what's been created, and who owns what within our organizations. And I'm sure a question will probably come up, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer it here. I'm not looking at the questions yet, but kind of what's the difference between utilizing this and a tool like SQL Mesh or dbt? And it really kind of boils down to the developer experience. And in some cases, there are solutions or engineers specifically that you really want to have just the pure flexibility and what you believe to be the speed of being able to write code as fast as you can. And if that's who you are, by all means, like a tool like dbt or SQL Mesh is really, really great for supporting something like that. But at Coalesce, the developer experience really boils down to, we want to be able to have governed standard data models where we can build things one time or define things one time and allow anyone in the organization to be able to take advantage of that without having to worry about the tech debt that typically gets accumulated with writing lots of code slightly different than the rest of your organization. And as code inevitably changes or logic inevitably changes over time, having to go back through and find out how we're going to update that and how it's going to impact things further downstream. And so I will stop my spiel there. I was talking for 40 minutes straight, so thank you guys for letting me ramble on. I'm going to go over to the chat here and see if we have anything in here. Can we do an inner join, right join, left join? Yeah, so again, anything that is supported within Snowflake or the data platform that you're working on is going to be available when working in Coalesce. So if that's a left join or a right join or a full outer join or a cross join, that's going to be fully supported. So all that's going to be available. You're good to go when it comes to development there. So looking, can I use this in another database technology? 100%. So currently we support Databricks, Microsoft Fabric, and Snowflake. We have plans to support 2 more databases coming out here in probably in the next 3 to 6 months or so. So keep an eye out on our website for that announcement. If you want to use Coalesce, you can do so for free. You can just go to coalesce.io and sign up for a free trial account. And actually, if you're already on Snowflake, we're available in the Snowflake Partner Connect ecosystem. So if you just go to, I believe it's data products within your Snowflake account, and then go to Partner Connect, you can just search for Coalesce, and you can use a free trial account within your current Snowflake account if you do that as well. So feel free to play around with it. Happy to connect with you on LinkedIn if you have any questions. And yeah, with that, I'm not seeing any other questions come through here. Steven, I don't know if you have any questions.
Yeah, I actually do have one. Actually, first of all, I meant to ask you, I remember a time when Coalesce only worked with Snowflake. Did you add Databricks and Fabric recently?
Yeah, so Databricks, we released into public preview about 3 months ago, and then Fabric is in private preview right now. I could do a demo on Fabric if we needed to right now, but hey, if anyone's out there and they want to buy Coalesce from Microsoft Fabric, by all means, reach out.
Cool. And then I guess more broadly, I was just wondering, we had the session last week about dbt, and I think, people on this call and people who will watch this video have maybe tried tools like dbt and SQL Mesh, and I kind of want to ask about the topic that's on everybody's mind these days, which is AI. Yeah. And as a developer who occasionally works in those tools, I'm starting to figure out my personal workflow, which involves Claude or Cursor or whatever, interacting with a file-based transformation system. So yes. I'm just curious, like your perspective. I appreciate the demo you walked through of all the GUI interfaces and UI tools that you can use to define your pipeline. But how do you see this interacting with AI in the future?
Great question. So to your point, Steven, if you want to use a specific AI assistant for helping write code, because everything is version controlled, we can point that directly to your repository where you're storing all of your Coalesce code to be able to interact with it. So that, number one, off the bat, is absolutely a possibility. The second thing, let me jump back in here into Coalesce. There's a couple other components here that are AI related, just built into the platform. One thing that we didn't touch is actually this Copilot that's here. And let me go ahead, let's just jump into a node. If I were to click into Copilot, it's basically my way of being able to work with my data in a way where I can basically, this sounds almost too good to be true. And in certain ways, it doesn't quite work the way that I would necessarily what I'm about to say, but you can basically prompt your way to building a data pipeline where, especially if I'm a lesser technical user and I want to be able to write a transformation that I don't know the syntax to, I could come in here and basically say, hey, how do I write this window function to be able to apply this to the specific column? I could also, one of my favorite things that I often come in here and do is I can take a big CTE, a multi-step CTE, paste the code in here, and then have the Coalesce Copilot break that out into my pipeline subcomponents. So it's basically going to take each of those CTEs as a logical block, like we were talking about, and create that as its own individual node for each CTE that's available, and build you a pipeline that basically represents exactly what was happening, taking into account all that business logic, what was available in that specific CTE. And then there are other AI components that are kind of built into the user interface. We could have Coalesce automatically describe like all the documentation for the objects that we're working with. We could also do that for Git commits. We could do that for documentation inside of what we call the catalog, which we didn't really jump into today. But I think kind of the workflow that we're starting to see from users is basically exactly what you mentioned, Steven, which is, hey, I'm using this tool already. Can I connect that to Coalesce? And the answer is yes. And then if I just want to use the GUI, if I'm maybe a less technical person and I don't know how to use Claude Code or anything like that, are there other components within the user interface that allow me to continue to work with my data utilizing AI so that it's an even more accelerated workflow and allows me to kind of automate more mundane tasks that I would have originally had to have dealt with myself. So kind of my feedback there.
Awesome. Very cool to see. And there was just one more question in the chat.
I see that. Is there monitoring subsystem or tool to understand when there's latency or performance in the transformation? Yes. So there's a couple different areas that we could go to take a look at that. The first would be actually inside the node itself. So again, if I were to create this, we surface very, very, very high level information here. It's just going to be, hey, when this started and how long it ran for. And the same is going to be true for if we execute the actual DML for this node. Basically, when did it start and how long did it actually run for? So we actually have some of that telemetry available there. But this really comes into play when it comes to when we deploy our actual pipelines themselves. And so if I were to come down here, I'm going to find a refresh recently. I typically fail my refreshes so I can show people what it looks like. I'm going to find one that succeeded. And I can come in here and have basically full telemetry of exactly what happened during a run. And so this is a pipeline that I've deployed into an environment in Snowflake. I can see it ran for 50 minutes and 51 seconds, the start time, the end time, and every single execution step that it took along the way. I can see how long each of those steps actually ran for. And if I click into any of this detail, I can see what each step was actually performing. And so I can continue to kind of dig a little deeper into what was going on along the way. And so that is, from the transformation component, the best way to kind of understand what's happening within my transformations from a monitoring standpoint. And then we also have another product that we call Catalog, which is going to allow you to have similar types of telemetry where not just focused on what you're building in Coalesce, but focused in your entire data stack. How long are things running? How things are connected? And what should I be concerned about if something were to break or take a long time to run? So that is monitoring within Coalesce. Any other questions? I love it.
Well, thank you very much, Josh, for this presentation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I know for myself, I always can appreciate a tool much more when I've seen it in action. So I appreciate the walkthrough.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. If anyone has any questions, again, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to answer any questions. Obviously, keep joining these sessions. Stephen, you've been doing an awesome job over there, just providing all this value to all these people. So love what you guys are doing. Big fan of what you guys are doing. And yeah, appreciate you guys having me.
Sounds good. Thanks, Josh. You got time for one more? There was one quick last question about security and encryption.
What about encryption and masking and security? Great questions. All right. So from I'm gonna rewind. The architecture of Coalesce, we do not actually ingest any data. So we're only looking at metadata from your data platform. So basically where the table is created and all the components of that table or the object that we're working with. And so we're never actually touching the data itself. And so from an encryption standpoint, we do provide additional encryption, but we're never actually touching the data itself. When it comes to masking, if you're asking about masking specific columns or data policy masking, we do support that. That's actually one of those packages that we could just go out to the marketplace and install and have that masking available as well. And then from a security standpoint, broad question, but we already talked a little bit about the encryption standpoint. We're not actually touching any data. RBAC is fully built into the platform. And so if you're worried about any sort of role-based access control, that's available within the platform as well. Trying to think if I'm missing anything major, but yeah, I think all three of those things fully supported by Coalesce. In fact, if you have something that's super proprietary or in a government region within AWS or wherever you're working, we can support that as well and sign a contract with you to make sure that we support that as well. So great questions there.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll let you go. Thanks, Josh. And
appreciate it.
Everyone else on the call, if you ever want to try out Coalesce or try any other data tools that are out there or need any support with your own data pipeline or data processing, please feel free to reach out to us at Database Tycoon. We'd love to hear from you. And yeah, we'll be here again next week for the next session. So thank you all and take care.
Thank you guys. Bye.